So up next, we have an armchair discussion focused on emissions accounting. Please welcome our moderator, Catrina Rorke, Senior Vice President of Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council, and she will be joined by Karthik Ramanna, Co-founder and Principal at the E-Ledgers Institute.
Haha, Heather. All right, such a pleasure to be with y'all today. Thank you for being here to talk about clean energy in all its forms and what we can do working with policymakers to accelerate American interests. Permitting is obviously very key to enabling a whole lot of investment in clean American industry. We're going to talk about another way to enable investment in clean American industry with a focus on carbon accounting. So perfect walk-up song. I think we all appreciate that U.S. industry enjoys a carbon advantage. We are a more efficient manufacturing economy than global competitors, but we do need to be able to reliably prove that. And so we're seeing increasing international pressure pushing us towards an emissions accounting system rooted in accuracy, transparency, and comparability. And we just so happen to have a preeminent expert on that subject with us on stage. Pleasure to have you, Karthik. I'm hoping you can introduce us to yourself and also what is the E-Ledgers Institute introducing to the conversation?
Sure. So thank you for having me. I am a professor at the University of Oxford, but I'm also the co-founder and principal investigator of this oddly named institute called the E-Ledger Institute. And what is the E-Ledger Institute? Well, let me take you back to a historical parallel. Up until the year 1935, there was no such thing as generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP. And it's hard to sort of imagine today, but in the 1920s, when companies traded on the New York Stock Exchange, they made up their own definition of revenue. They made up their own definition of assets. They made up their own definition of liabilities. And by the way, they didn't even have to tell you what those definitions were. So as you can imagine, it was all very, very chaotic. And then we ended up with a bubble in 29, and we ended up with a crash, and we ended up with the Great Depression. And then in 1935, 17 people got around a table here in Washington, D.C., and said, well, maybe it's a good idea that we all have the same definition of an asset, and we all have the same definition of revenue. And so the idea of generally accepted accounting principles was born. And it turns out that's a really good idea. It was an American invention, but it very quickly spread around the world. Of course, World War II intervened, and by the time you get to the 50s and 60s, of course, GAAP has taken off. Now, we're at a similar point in this journey to decarbonization. And that is to say, we need as Catrina mentioned, an accurate, a rigorous, a verifiable, and a comparable system of carbon accounts that is politically and ideologically agnostic, that basically counts moles of CO2. And this institute that we've created, I'm at Oxford, but some of my co-authors are at Stanford and MIT and Harvard. This institute we've created is basically an institute to drive this idea into practice. And just as soon as we've done that, we hope this institute can fold and we can go on to writing our next papers or whatever it is we want to do. So that's what we are.
The grand ambitions of professors to write next papers. Okay, before we walk into how you are driving towards this change, help us sort of ground in an understanding. If we move to something like GAAP for greenhouse gas emissions or for emissions associated with manufacturing more broadly, how does that help us deliver on sort of any number of private industry goals or policy goals? You talk about neutrality, so what are we really enabling here?
Yeah. So for one, as you mentioned, and there's a great CLC report on this, that the United States has this advantage when it comes to clean manufacturing, right? But when you think about it, that advantage is not something that the United States can price. It's not an advantage that it can monetize as part of its competitive offering in the global economy, which in some sense is odd given that the United States created this global economy. We've created a global economy where companies compete on cost, they compete on quality, they compete on the timeliness of their delivery, right? So 3 dimensions. Well, turns out there's this 4th dimension, which is your emissions efficiency. But that dimension is not getting priced in markets because we don't have this comparable basis for companies to be able to show that. Now imagine that you create that. Suddenly, you've got the ability for American companies to be able to showcase this advantage that's currently hidden, right? And by the way, we saw this before with the invention of just-in-time inventory accounting systems in the 60s and 70s. So we've seen this before. Let me give you a quick example of that. So up until the 1950s, 1960s, before we invented just-in-time or JIT inventory accounting, effectively companies competed on just 2 dimensions, cost and quality, right? And then in the 60s and 70s, particularly with Japanese companies that pursued and championed JIT, just-in-time. Now that allowed for companies to go from holding weeks and months of inventory in their warehouses to holding days or hours of inventory. On certain products, Toyota famously holds just 2 hours of inventory. Now imagine you take all that capital that you were tying up in things like, holding inventory in warehouses, and you can deploy that capital on new product development or marketing or all kinds of other things, right? So effectively what we did was take a 2-dimensional global economy and make it 3-dimensional. Now, because we have this strength and this advantage as a US economy, let's make that a 4th dimension. And that's where I think, something like this can really be driven into practice. Yeah.
Wonderful. So you talk about, how private market actors sort of decided to move us to GAAP, added this just-in-time delivery. Talk to us about how you're working with private industry, pilot projects you're developing. Who is buying into this, and how's the process going, and sort of taking up learning lessons and moving forward?
Yeah. So when we first came out with this idea, it was about 4 or 5 years ago, we published papers. As we're professors, so we publish papers. And one of the first questions we got was from a regulator who happened to read the paper. I was thrilled that this regulator had read the paper. And he said, "Who's doing this?" And we said, "Well, nobody's doing it. We just dreamt it up in our offices." And he said, "Well, that's a problem. If you ever want this to be adopted, you need to get some real companies to do this." And quite frankly, that's why we created this eLedger Institute. The good news is, over the course of the last 4 or 5 years that we've been in operation, we've now had dozens of companies, including some very large companies in the oil and gas sector, in the cement sector, in the steel sector, in the automotive sector, in the tire-making sector, in the healthcare sector, pilot this approach. And I say the good news is that every single company that has piloted this approach has not done it out of the goodness of their heart. They have done this because they have a competitive advantage that is going unpriced. Going back to what I said earlier, right? Imagine you can make a bag of cement with the same structural properties as your competitor, but for lower emissions. Now, if there's a comparable, accurate way in which you can demonstrate that to certain customers, those customers will pay a premium. That's money currently left on the table. Those are the kinds of companies that are piloting this approach. A bag of cement is not a bag of cement. A barrel of oil is not a barrel of oil. A bar of steel is not a bar of steel. All of these commodities go on to becoming things that become the basis for competitive differentiation if you commoditize carbon. So you say, commoditize carbon and decommoditize everything else. You unleash so much value, especially for American companies that already have this built-in advantage when it comes to clean manufacturing.
Perfect. So now we know why they want to. Tell us, what is an e-ledger, and how is it distinguished from sort of typical approaches to emissions measurement, reporting, verification? What is the innovation that is carbon accounting?
That's right. So, you'll recall I started with this comment that it needs to be ideologically and technologically agnostic. And that's at the heart of this, right? So effectively, you take something like this iPhone. This iPhone has an embedded carbon footprint to it. And if you have an iPhone with you, chances are it was made in a different production batch than this iPhone, and it will have its own embedded carbon emissions to it, right? And just like Apple is able to track the cost of its products from batch to batch in order to be able to say, okay, well, what are we doing right or what are we doing wrong about our production processes in order to be more competitive. What this technology enables you to do is to track the embedded emissions of any product or service. By the way, it doesn't have to be a product. It could be a service. Like an hour of McKinsey consulting is the same thing. Anything that has a cost can have an embedded emissions to it, which is dynamic and real time, right? That's what the innovation here is. Now, how does that work and why do you need a ledger? The role of the ledger is basically to hold the emissions as they're incurred. You know, everything is counted once and only once. So that is to say that I currently need some steel in order to make this iPhone. Let's say that steel needs a trace amount of metallurgical coal in order to make. So now when I'm in a coal mine, mining that metallurgical coal, there are some emissions associated with that. Those emissions get recorded on the ledger of the coal mine. Then as the coal mine sells its inventory to the steel company that turns that metallurgical coal into steel, the emissions get transferred from the ledger of the coal mine to the ledger of the steel company. As the steel company then makes the steel and sells that steel on to, say, Apple's supplier, those emissions get transferred on to those suppliers' ledger. As that supplier then sells its products on to Apple, those emissions get transferred on to Apple's ledger. And eventually, the point of sale to the end consumer is when it moves on to the jurisdictional ledger. If that flow basically sounds familiar, it should, because it's exactly how GDP accounting works, right? So effectively, what you're doing is creating a parallel system to how the financial accounting system, double-entry bookkeeping, which, by the way, is one of the greatest inventions of, I think, human beings. You take something like that, and you apply it to this problem, okay? And the advantage of doing something like that is you're, again, able to track these emissions as they move through supply chains. And you're able to create basis for competitive differentiation at each step of the way.
So if you were to ask Apple to do that today, what they would do is sort of run through their Scope 1 emissions, their Scope 2 emissions, emissions associated with their supply chain, and make a best guess. What you're suggesting is that we can move to using information that already exists in the marketplace in a new way to improve precision and comparability and sort of like many dimensions that'll help us make better decisions.
That's absolutely right, yes. And you'll notice that I don't use these words Scope 1, Scope 2, et cetera, because in some sense that's not the right way to think about it. There are direct emissions. Those are the only emissions, by the way, that enter the atmosphere. So they're the only emissions that need to get counted. And they need to get counted only once, not an arbitrary, indefinite number of times. So it's just those direct emissions, and the rest of it is supply chain accounting. Basically, inventory accounting, application of double-entry bookkeeping, things we've been doing for hundreds of years. What makes this system so simple to apply is that we've already trained millions of accountants out there in the real world to effectively apply these principles. Now, instead of accounting for them in dollars and cents, they can also account for things in, say, moles of CO2 that go into the atmosphere. So that's actually a core advantage of this. Now, I'll be honest that when I started this project about 4 or 5 years ago, I was worried that this would somehow turn into kind of like the Chemical Engineering Full Employment Act or something like that, because we'd have to have thousands or millions of chemical engineers sitting there telling us what are the emissions from this product or that. But it turns out that as we've done these pilots, and this is why these pilots have been so useful, it turns out that you don't need to do that, right? And let me give you an example. Let's go back to the cement case. So if you're making cement, the core source, one of the biggest sources of emissions, in fact, 70% of the emissions in cement making come from one chemical reaction, which is the reaction that converts limestone into clinker, right? So limestone is CaCO3, clinker is CaO, and the difference is CO2 that goes into the atmosphere. If you're a modern cement factory today, it turns out that you weigh your inputs of limestone and your outputs of clinker on a weekly or monthly basis. So if you know what those inputs are on a weekly or monthly basis, and you know what the underlying chemical reaction is, then you don't actually need millions of meters on smokestacks. It's basic arithmetic to figure out how much CO2 went out into the atmosphere. So we've now done these pilots on fairly sophisticated products. For instance, I did not realize how sophisticated the production process is to make the kidney grill on a BMW car. This is basically that kind of famous thing that sits on the front of it. Turns out BMW puts a lot of thought and effort into that because they never want the paint to chip, right? It's so precious to their brand, and yet it has to take the brunt of the aerodynamic forces. So there are all these kinds of specialty paints that are only fabricated for this product, that are fabricated by like one company somewhere out there, et cetera. So we said, oh my God, it's going to be so costly, so expensive, so complex to figure out what are the emissions of this kidney grill. Where it turns out it's not, because all you need is the underlying chemical reactions and what are the inputs and outputs of the various products and of the various other chemicals that are used in those chemical reactions. We already know that information from our financial inventories. So you start putting these things together, you can actually get the basis of this system going pretty quickly. And that's something we've learned. So, we can sort of prime this system pretty quickly. And I'm pretty sort of optimistic about, we can put our institute, the eLedger Institute, out of business in 5 years. That's my goal.
So everything we've spoken about so far is sort of voluntarily taken on by industry, can be achieved with information that industry has, but we wouldn't be at National Clean Energy Week if we weren't talking about a policy nexus. So if you could sort of wave a magic wand to catalyze carbon accounting, achieve one policy outcome in the United States, what would that look like?
Yeah, so I've learned not to tell people that I work on carbon accounting because when I do, they kind of sort of look for someone else to talk to in a cocktail party. So I might be one of the few people in the world that gets very excited about carbon accounting, but I appreciate that not everybody does. Okay, so what that means is that we need what's called pull factors, right? Few people get excited about accounting for its own sake, but you need a pull factor that actually allows for accounting to become sort of this kind of accounting to become public policy. And that's where I think, this rising sort of political momentum around economic nationalism, particularly here in the United States and in the European Union, can be incredibly helpful. Because, of course, production in the United States and particularly in Northern Europe tends to be very clean. And one of the things that climate policy, particularly in the EU, has done over the course of the last 2 decades is it has deindustrialized Europe and it has increased emissions by basically engaging in what's called leakage. It's moved emissions from clean production in Europe to, say, less clean production in other parts of the world. So what the momentum of economic nationalism is doing is basically creating a basis or creating a demand for something that allows for a carbon accounting system to be put in place, because that carbon accounting system is going to be the basis of some sort of carbon border adjustment or a foreign emission tariff, whatever you might want to call it, right? A foreign pollution fee. There are all kinds of different proposals out there. All of those proposals need effectively what's called an assessment basis in accounting lingo. This is that assessment basis. So the forces of economic nationalism, which are well justified in the context of all of the economic forces that people, working class people, are feeling in different parts of the world, might well be that pull factor that makes something as, quite frankly, boring as carbon accounting the thing that needs to get done.
I think everybody here is going to be talking about carbon accounting at their next cocktail party, so have no fear. You'll be a welcome guest. Thank you so much, Karthik, and thank you.